Welcome to Fresh Catholic Teaching Courses. This is series number 6. This is episode 6 of series number 6, our Lenten series. And as I've remarked a couple of times so far, at Fresh Catholic, we're taking a little bit of a different tack for our Lenten series in that what we're doing is we're transporting ourselves back in time, so to speak, to 33 AD, to the original Holy Week, and we're going through that original Holy Week day by day to learn what happened on each one of those days. So when we celebrate Holy Week this year, as we get to each of those days, we can reflect back and meditate on what happened on that same day of the original Holy Week. And hopefully that will enable us to have a more deep, a more profound, a more meaningful Holy Week. We're devoting basically an episode per day. So we had, a Palm Sunday. We had what was called Cleansing Monday, Teaching Tuesday, Spy Wednesday, all individual episodes. And Holy Thursday and Good Friday, because so much happened on those 2 days, we're spreading those 2 days over 2 episodes. Last episode, we did Holy Thursday Part 1. This episode will be Holy Thursday Part 2, completing our Part 2 episode study on Holy Thursday. Same sort of thing when we get to Good Friday. We'll spread Good Friday over 2 episodes. We'll call them Good Friday Part 1, Good Friday Part 2, and then we'll wrap up with a look at Holy Saturday and, of course, Easter Sunday. So we said at the beginning of last episode when we started Holy Thursday that we were going to look at 6 different events in Holy Thursday. They were in order: the journey from Bethlehem to Jerusalem Thursday morning. We've done that. Then we had preparations for the Passover meal. We did that. The actual Last Supper, which was a Passover meal, we did that. The agony in the garden and the arrest in the garden. So those are the 5 events we treated Holy Thursday Part 1 last episode. The 6th and final event, which we'll treat this episode, Holy Thursday Part 2, are the 3 Jewish trials. And if you're thinking, okay, Charles, an entire episode, and they tend to run around 45 minutes, some of them a little bit longer, but by and large, each episode we do in these teaching courses, about 45 minutes. So you're thinking, well, Charles, 45 minutes to talk about 3 Jewish trials, are you sure about that? And the answer is yes, I am sure, because what's so beautiful about the Catholic faith, theology, Scripture, is, it's so rich and so deep and so profound, and there's so many nuances and subtleties and details that once you pierce the surface and you start kind of unpacking these things, it brings up all kinds of things that maybe we never even considered before. So, and that's the case in everything we talk about in the Catholic faith, and it's certainly going to be the case with these 3 Jewish trials, because there's a lot more to them than maybe meets the eye. And our job this episode is to bring those things that don't immediately meet the eye, bring them to light, so that when we are meditating on them, when we go through Holy Week in our celebration this year, we can kind of meditate and kind of reflect on all of these events. Before we get into that, though, one thing I do want to double back for a second to yesterday's episode, because there was one thing I wanted to mention but didn't. And that is that, if you remember last episode, when they finish the Last Supper and they leave the upper room and they're going down into the Kidron Valley, they cross the Kidron Valley and they're going up to the Mount of Olives, into the Garden of Gethsemane, where we have Jesus' agony and arrest. As they're making that trip from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane, Mark drops in another detail for us. And we said a couple of times, both in this series and other series, that when the Holy Spirit inspires a gospel writer to drop in a detail that he otherwise would not have, that detail is in there for a reason. And because of that, it's incumbent upon us to find out exactly what that reason is. So Mark could have said, in essence, they left the upper room and they went to the Mount of Olives and into the Garden of Gethsemane. He could have just said that, but he dropped in the detail that while they were making that trip, They were singing a hymn. Now again, if you're inquisitive like I am, your first thoughts are, I wonder what hymn they were singing. And then you start kind of going through some possibilities in your head, right? You're thinking, well, were they singing Amazing Grace? And the answer is no, that song had not even been invented yet. Were they singing On Eagle's Wings? Again, no, that had not been invented yet. Were they singing Table of Plenty? No, because that song had not been invented yet. So if they weren't singing any of those well-known songs, what hymn were they singing? Well, they were singing some of the Psalms, because remember, the Psalms were originally written to be sung. And in Mass, when we get to the responsorial psalm on Sunday Mass and Masses on Holy Days of Obligations, we sing the responsorial psalm because the songs were meant to be sung. So the hymn they were singing when they left the upper room on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, they were singing Psalms 113 to 118, called collectively the great Hallel Psalms. Hallel, hallelujah, praise. So they were singing psalms of praise. And right in the middle of that 113 to 118 lies Psalm 116. And I want to kind of point out a couple of lines in that psalm that they were singing. Now, bear in mind, Jesus and his disciples are singing this psalm on the way from upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane. They're singing this psalm, Jesus is, and his disciples, Jesus, knowing he's going to go through his agony, he's going to get arrested, he's going to go through his passion, he's going to go through the crucifixion. He's singing this psalm knowing that's what lies ahead. Now listen to these words. Psalm 116. What shall I render to the Lord for all his bounty to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, I am thy servant, the son of thy handmaid. Thou hast looked upon my bonds. I will offer to thee the sacrifice of thanksgiving. So this was one part of the Psalms that Jesus and his disciples were singing as they made their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now think about that. Think about the words that I just spoke. Jesus was singing these words of praise to God and thanksgiving to God, knowing he's going to go through his agony, he's going to be arrested, he's going to go through 3 Jewish trials, he's going to go through 3 Roman trials, he's going to go through his passion, he's going to be scourged, and he's going to die by crucifixion. He's singing these words knowing that's what's ahead of him. Just another chance for us to reflect on how much he loves us, that he could sing those words knowing what he's about to go through for us. Amazing. So I should have mentioned that yesterday. I didn't, so I did want to at least take a couple of minutes on the front end of today to mention it. So now let's pick up the narrative, okay? We left last episode, Holy Thursday, part 1, Jesus is arrested. Now what they're going to do, and again, you've got Jesus, you've got Judas, you've got the Roman soldiers, you've got the temple guards, and now basically they're going to reverse course. They're going to go back down the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley, and now they're going to go into the house, into the residence of an individual named Annas. Now remember, they're making this journey. Jesus is bound and shackled, right? So they make their journey to the house, to the residence of Annas. And this begins the first of what are called the 3 Jewish trials. Now, who is Annas, and why are they bringing him to Annas to begin this process? Well, Annas, at this point in time, the current high priest is an individual called Caiaphas. We'll hear about him in a couple of minutes. The former high priest was Annas. Annas was the high priest from 6 A.D. He was the high priest right before Caiaphas was. He's Caiaphas's father-in-law. He's the former high priest, and right now he holds kind of a high priest emeritus type of position. He's sort of still the power behind the throne. So he still has a lot of respect from the people. So the thinking has always been that the Jewish religious leaders bring Jesus to Annas first because as the former high priest, as the high priest emeritus, as the power behind the throne still, the fact that he still garners a tremendous amount of respect, to show him that respect, they bring Jesus to him first. That's one reason. The other reason is kind of an interesting one, because Annas is a Sadducee, and Annas was the one that ran all the temple activities. And remember what those temple activities were? The merchants selling the animals, the money changers exchanging coins. And remember what we said about that? That Annas was getting a very hefty cut of all the proceeds. So when Jesus cleansed that temple, when he drove out the merchants and the animals, when he overturned the tables of the money changers, he brought that activity to a halt, which means he took money out of Annas's pockets. So that's another reason why the thinking has always been that they brought him to Annas first, is because Annas, because Jesus stopped those activities that were very lucrative for Annas, okay, Annas wanted first crack at him. So that's why the first Jewish trial is always held in front of Annas, to give him the respect that he still garners as the high priest emeritus, and because of the temple cleansing, to give him first crack at Jesus. Now, just to kind of give us a visual, all right, you've got Annas, the former high priest, and you've got Caiaphas, the current high priest. And best as can be thought of, their residences were kind of side by side, and they shared a common courtyard. Now, the reason I mention that is because that's the courtyard Peter is going to eventually make his way into, where he denies Jesus 3 times. So if you want a visual, you've got the residence of Annas, you've got the residence of Caiaphas, and they both open to a common courtyard. So again, let's pick up the narrative. Jesus is arrested. They go down the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley. They go to Annas's house. Now we know who Annas is. This begins the first of what are called the 3 Jewish trials. Now, the trial before Annas is it's more akin to what we would know as a preliminary hearing than it is a full-on trial. Because what Annas wants to do, what the Jewish religious leaders want to do when they bring Jesus to Annas, is they want to gather enough evidence to support a charge of blasphemy against Jesus. Because again, even though we're talking the Jewish trials, Rome was still the ruling nation. And one of the biggest things about Rome, other than their infrastructure and their architecture, is their system of laws. All right? Rome had a very definite system of laws. So, to bring a charge against an individual, you had to have evidence. Even if the Jewish religious leaders were seeking to bring a religious charge against somebody, They're still under the purview of Rome, so they still had to conduct themselves in a legal fashion. They still had to bring evidence to support whatever charge they were charging an individual with. Now, the Jewish religious leaders want to charge Jesus with blasphemy. Why blasphemy? Because that is the violation of the highest religious law they had. All right? The worst charge you can place on somebody, according to Jewish religious law, was blasphemy. And because that was the top charge, that carried with it a death sentence. You could be executed for blasphemy. And their goal is to get Jesus executed. Their goal is to put Jesus to death. So they want to hang a charge of blasphemy on him because that's a death penalty charge. But they've got to bring evidence to support a charge of blasphemy. So they're bringing Jesus to Annas in what's more akin to a preliminary hearing to try and gather that evidence that will support that charge of blasphemy, that will get Jesus executed. So that's who Annas is. That's why they're bringing him to Annas, and that's the reason that they're bringing him there, okay? To gather some evidence to support a charge of blasphemy. Now, how does this preliminary hearing / trial before Annas, how does that play off? Well, Jesus is brought before Annas, and we're told that Annas questions Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Again, trying to kind of gather evidence, right? Now, what is Jesus' response to this when Annas is asking him about his disciples and about the doctrine he's been teaching? Jesus says, "Why do you ask me? I've spoken publicly in the temple and the synagogues," which he's done, right? "Ask the people who heard me." And that's a very legitimate response, okay? I've taught publicly. People have heard what I've taught. Ask them. Why are you asking me? Well, at that point, one of the guards slaps Jesus and says, "Is that the way you talk to the high priest?" This slap by this guard, in this instance, is the first of what will be a number of slapping and hitting and punching and spitting and mocking and ridiculing Jesus. We know he went through a ton of that stuff, right? This guard slapping Jesus based on Jesus' response to Annas, that was the first in a series of these things. Now, how does Jesus respond to the slap? Again, a very valid and legitimate response. He says, "Hey, why do you hit me? If I've spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. If I've spoken rightly, why are you hitting me?" So you notice in Jesus' two responses, they're both eminently logical, eminently reasonable, very valid. Annas starts questioning him about his doctrine. Jesus says, "Why are you asking me? I haven't been in hiding. I haven't been teaching in secret. I've been teaching publicly. Ask the people who have heard me." Very legitimate response. And then after he gets hit here, he says, "Look, if I've spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong, but if I've spoken rightly, why are you hitting me?" Again, a very legitimate response. So here's Annas. Here are the Jewish religious leaders bringing Jesus before Annas, trying to gather evidence to support a charge of blasphemy, right? And Jesus is responding in a very reasoned, logical, valid way, which you can imagine are kind of getting underneath their skin, all right? Well, Annas realizes this is going nowhere, right? So he sends Jesus basically next door to Caiaphas, who is the current high priest, who is the son-in-law of Annas. So that's Jewish trial number one, more akin to a preliminary hearing, the trial before Annas, and we know who Annas is, why they gave Annas first crack at Jesus, how the back and forth between Annas and Jesus went, and the result of it, okay? They don't get necessarily what they're after, so they bring him next door for Jewish trial number two in front of the current high priest, which is Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas, again, he's trying to gather evidence to support a charge of blasphemy because that's a death penalty charge. So now Caiaphas is trying to get false testimony against Jesus. And it's interesting. Now, again, this is all happening after Jesus' arrest. This is happening very, very, very late Holy Thursday night into the very wee hours of Good Friday morning. We're talking about late Holy Thursday night to 12, 1, 2 o'clock Friday morning. So this is happening in the dead of night. And we're told that many witnesses came forth, but their testimony was false and their testimony contradicted. Now, again, let's hit the pause button for a second because we don't want this to pass us by, all right? Again, given the hour that this is going on, very, very, up to, at, or just after around midnight, Holy Thursday night. This is the dead of night. But yet, many witnesses come forth to provide testimony which will be false and contradictory. And you have to think, okay, were there that many people wandering the streets of Jerusalem in the dead of night that many witnesses could be located? I doubt that, which seems to suggest that these witnesses were located and met with, and it was prearranged for them to come at this dead of the night hour to give their testimony, because I doubt that many people would be walking around the streets of Jerusalem in the dead of night. But be that as it may, they came forth, they gave testimony, it was false, and it was contradictory. All right? So Caiaphas, in Jewish trial number 2, is getting no further than Annas did in Jewish trial number 1. So finally, Caiaphas begins to take matters into his own hands. And he addresses Jesus specifically, right? He says, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Basically, he's trying to get Jesus to self-incriminate himself. I think that's to self-incriminate. Because he says, "Are you are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Now, how does Jesus respond? Now, remember how he responded to Annas. Very, very logical, very valid, very reasoned. When Caiaphas says, "Look, are you the Messiah? Are you, let's cut through all of this stuff. Let me ask you straight. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God?" Again, just like we saw with Teaching Tuesday, if you remember that episode, when all of those factions of Jewish religious leaders posed a question to try and get Jesus to discredit himself, and those questions were designed to elicit yes or no answers. Same kind of thing here. When Caiaphas says, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" he's trying to get from Jesus, "Yes, I am. No, I'm not." But just like we saw in Teaching Tuesday, Jesus doesn't take the bait. He doesn't say, "Yes, I am," or "No, I'm not." What does he say? He says to Caiaphas, "You have said so. And from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven." Now let's hit the pause button. Caiaphas asks a straightforward yes or no question. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? Look at how Jesus responds. First of all, he says, you have said so. And what kind of a response is that? What does that even mean? What is Jesus telling Caiaphas when he says, you have said so? And then it gets even more curious. He follows that up by saying, from now on, you're going to see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power coming on the clouds of heaven. And you're saying to yourself, not only is that doesn't seem like a yes or no question, what kind of response even is that? What does that even mean? How does that respond to Caiaphas' question, if at all? What exactly is Jesus telling Caiaphas when he responds this way? Well, let's see if we can unpack the two parts of Jesus' response. Again, the question, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? First part of Jesus' response, you have said so. Now, I want you to keep that part of his response in the corner of your mind. You have said so. Because as we get to Good Friday, in our next two episodes, Pilate is going to be questioning Jesus. And Pilate is going to ask him what seems like an easy yes or no question. Are you the King of the Jews? And Jesus is going to respond to Pilate the same way he responds to Caiaphas here. When Pilate asks, are you the King of the Jews? Jesus is going to respond, you have said so. So this is a response Jesus is going to give right now to Caiaphas and tomorrow, Good Friday, to Pilate. So when Jesus tells Caiaphas and Pilate, you have said so, what is he saying? What is he getting at? Okay? Well, for Caiaphas is asking, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? Jesus says, you have said so. Basically, what that's getting at is, okay, Caiaphas, this is what you say. All right? Now, are you saying this because you, Caiaphas, believe it? Or are you saying this because the Jewish religious leaders are telling you this? Is this what you believe, Caiaphas? Or are you getting, or are these Jewish religious leaders in your ear? That's what he's getting to. So when he says to Pilate, when Pilate says, are you the King of the Jews? And Jesus responds similarly, he's asking Pilate, do you say I'm the King of the Jews, or are you getting that from the Jewish religious leaders? So he's basically asking Caiaphas and Pilate, is this what you believe, or are you getting this because these people are in your ear, so to speak? So that's the first part of his response. You have said so. But how about the second, more curious part about the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power coming on the clouds of heaven? What Jesus is doing there is he's quoting a prophet. And the prophet he's quoting is the prophet Daniel. And he's drawing this quote from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. Now let's take a look at Daniel 7, verses 13 to 14, and let's see what Daniel prophesied. This is Daniel 7, 13 and 14 that Jesus quotes to Caiaphas after Caiaphas wants to know if he's the Messiah, if he's the Son of God. Here's what Daniel says. This is Daniel speaking. As the visions during the night continued, I saw coming with the clouds of heaven one like a son of man when he reached the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. He received dominion, splendor, and kingship. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away. His kingship, one that shall not be destroyed. Now, Daniel is talking about this coming Messiah, this Savior, all right, who Jesus is. So when Jesus quotes these two verses from Daniel back to Caiaphas, he's essentially telling Caiaphas, you want to know if I'm the Messiah? You want to know if I'm the Son of God? Think back to what Daniel prophesied. That's your answer. So in a sense, in so many words, without actually saying it, Jesus is saying, yes, I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. I am that person Daniel prophesied about. All right? I am, my kingship will never end. My kingdom will never end. I'll have everlasting dominion. All right? And coming on the clouds of heaven, the Jewish people understood that as a reference to God. So not only is Jesus telling Caiaphas, yes, I'm the Messiah. Yes, I'm the Son of God. In fact, I am God. So in essence, he's telling Caiaphas, yes, I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God in so many words. And Caiaphas, being the high priest, would have been very familiar with Daniel 7, verses 13 to 14, and he would have understood the meaning of it. So what Jesus was telling him was not lost on Caiaphas. Caiaphas understood exactly how Jesus is responding to his question. In essence, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? In so many words, Jesus says yes. Not specifically, but by quoting Daniel's prophecy of the coming Messiah and Son of God. So that's the meaning of Jesus' rather curious response. Now, we said this was not lost on Caiaphas. Caiaphas understood exactly what Jesus was telling him by quoting Daniel 7. How do we know that Caiaphas understood exactly what Jesus was saying? Look at Caiaphas' response to Jesus' response. How does Caiaphas respond to Jesus quoting Daniel 7? Okay? Caiaphas says, in essence, that's it. We don't need any more witnesses. We've all heard the blasphemy. So Caiaphas characterizes Jesus' response as blasphemy because Jesus says, yes, I'm the Messiah. Yes, I'm the Son of God. Yes, I'm God. All of which the Jewish religious leaders did not believe and did not accept. They viewed Jesus as a mere man. So in claiming to be God, he is committing blasphemy. So at this point, remember, going into these Jewish trials, coming out of them, the Jewish religious leaders want to hang a charge of blasphemy on Jesus because that's a death penalty charge, and they want Jesus' death. Now, after Jesus responds by way of Daniel 7, Caiaphas recognizes what he's saying, and he says, we've all heard the blasphemy. So at this point, you would think, okay, they've got the charge they're looking for. Jesus, by calling himself the Son of God, etc., has committed blasphemy. That's it. They've got the charge. Well, if that was the case, then why would we need a third Jewish trial? It seems like they've got their charge right here in Jewish trial number 2. If that were to be the case, then there would be no need for a third trial. But we know there is a third trial. So, do they have the charge they're looking for? Or is there still more work to be done? Well, let's continue the narrative, right? Now again, let me hit the pause button. While all of this is going on inside the house of Caiaphas, right? First inside the house of Annas, now inside the house of Caiaphas. While all of this has been going on, kind of split screen version. One screen, we're looking at inside Annas' house and inside Caiaphas' house. The other part of our split screen, there's the courtyard. And now Peter and John are in that courtyard. And there is a maid that recognizes Peter and calls him on it. Okay, says, hey, aren't you one of his followers? Now we know Peter's going to deny Jesus 3 times in this courtyard. We know Jesus told Peter ahead of time in that upper room, look, Peter, before the cock crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times. So now we have the courtyard scene, and now those denials start. So get the split screen here. Inside the house of Annas first and Caiaphas next. Jesus is basically on trial for his life, right? Outside in the courtyard, Peter's denying him. And this is going on at the same time. What a contrast. But now let's narrow our focus a little bit, okay? Let's take a look at Peter's 3-fold denials, because there's an interesting progression that sometimes isn't kind of realized. So, there's a maid, right? And she recognizes Peter, says, hey, aren't you one of his followers? Peter his first denial, he says, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, a very general denial. Hey, aren't you one of his followers? I don't even know what you're talking about, right? Then some of the bystanders, okay, ask him, hey, yeah, you're one of his followers, right? Peter then ups the denial. He goes from, I don't know what you're talking about, denial number 1. Denial number 2 is, I don't know the man. So as the questioning of Peter gets a little bit more intense, Peter's denials get a little bit more intense. He's gone from, I don't know what you're talking about, to, I don't know the man. Doesn't even use Jesus' name. I don't know the man. Again, trying to distance himself, right? And a third time he's asked, no, you're one of his disciples. And we're told the third denial, Peter ratchets it up again, because we're told now he curses and swears and says, I don't know the man. So in Peter's 3-fold denial, which Jesus told Peter he was going to do, we know that, again, it played out exactly the way Jesus said it would, okay? Peter does deny him in that courtyard 3 times before the cock crows twice. But what's oftentimes missed is, as the questioning of Peter about him being one of Jesus' followers, as that gets more and more pointed and more intense, Peter's denials get more and more intense. From, I don't know what you're talking about, to I don't know the man, to him cursing and swearing and saying, I don't know the man. And all of this is happening in that courtyard regarding Peter. At the same time, Jesus is inside in front of the former high priest and the current high priest, basically on trial for his life. What a contrast. Inside, Jesus is being interrogated. Outside, in essence, Peter's getting interrogated. Inside, Jesus doesn't deny who he is. Outside, Peter denies Jesus. So quite a contrast going on simultaneously inside and outside. Now, let me say one more thing about these denials. Because Mark, who we said yesterday, last episode, brings out a lot of details. Mark brings out another interesting detail that's kind of hidden in there, but is very suggestive. Because back in the upper room, Jesus told Peter, before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. All right? Now, if you look at how Mark records this incident, After Peter's third denial, Mark indicates the cock crowed for the second time. So Jesus was right. Before the cock crows twice, Peter will deny Jesus 3 times. Right after that third denial, the cock crowed the second time. So the cock crowed the second time after Peter's third denial, just like Jesus said. But if the cock crowed the second time after Peter's third denial, that must have meant, and see if you can track with me here, that must have meant that the cock crowed the first time either after Peter's first denial or after Peter's second denial. You see what I'm saying? Because the cock is going to crow twice. The second one after Peter's third denial. So the first one had to be before Peter's third denial, which means it had to be before the first denial or the second denial. Now, the reason this is brought up is the thinking has been that if you're Peter and Jesus' prediction is ringing in your ears, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows twice, and now you're Peter, you're in that courtyard, and you're beginning those denials, and you hear the first cock crow, you would have hoped, hearing that first cock crow, Peter would have said, oh, wait a second, I just heard a cock crow. Jesus told me that cock is going to crow twice, and I'm going to deny Jesus 3 times. So maybe what Jesus said is coming true. So if the cock crowed once already, then maybe I better back off of these denials. You see what I'm saying? In other words, that first cock crow could have been a kind of warning sign to Peter. Hey, you know, you're on the way to denying me 3 times. The cock is going to crow the second time after the third one. The cock has crowed already once. Back away from the rest of your denials. Okay, this is kind of a warning sign. But either Peter didn't hear it or disregarded it or whatever. But it's very interesting that Mark says the cock crowed the second time, which means, if you think about it, he had to have crowed the first time before that third denial. And I've always wondered, did Peter hear it? And if he heard it, did it give him pause that he is about to play out what Jesus predicted? We'll never know, but it's interesting to kind of think about that. So at any rate, that's what's going on, right? So now they've got the charge of blasphemy, Jewish trial number 2. But we have a third Jewish trial. And like I said, if they've got the charge of blasphemy, why do they need a third trial? Well, the third trial, now, if we go through time, the third trial, the first trial before Annas, the second trial before Caiaphas, that was late Thursday night into the wee hours of Friday morning. Now it's dawn Friday morning. And that's when the third Jewish trial starts. All right? And this Jewish trial is going to be in front of the entire Sanhedrin. Now, who are the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin are 70 members made up of the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. There's 70 of them, and the 71st one is the high priest. He presides over the Sanhedrin. And if you think about it, the Sanhedrin is kind of like our version of the Supreme Court. You know how the Supreme Court has justices and then you have a chief justice? Well, the Sanhedrin had 70 members, and you had the chief member, the high priest, and he presided over the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, they dealt with all the Jewish religious and legal cases, all right? Because Rome, Rome didn't care about whatever the Jewish laws were. They didn't care about the Jewish legal situations. They cared if something violated Roman law, if something violated civil law. They didn't care if somebody or something violated the Jewish religious laws. They could care less about that. But they said, okay, Jewish people, okay, you have your Jewish law, you have the crimes against it, all right? We're a nation of laws here in Rome. We have a legal system set up. So you can convene your Sanhedrin to deal with your Jewish laws, all right, so that we don't have to be bothered with them. So that's what the Sanhedrin did. They were convened anytime a capital Jewish law was violated. Now, this is a capital Jewish law, blasphemy. So the Sanhedrin, in order to officially hang a charge of blasphemy on Jesus, that charge had to be rendered by the entire Sanhedrin. Now, Caiaphas, the high priest, has just basically rendered it himself. You've heard the blasphemy, he said, right? But his hanging a charge of blasphemy on Jesus isn't official yet. That charge has to be formalized. It has to be made official by the entire Sanhedrin. And the entire Sanhedrin can only meet during the daylight. That's the reason for the third Jewish trial. The third Jewish trial involved the entire Sanhedrin, and it was held at daybreak because the charge of blasphemy that Caiaphas elicited from Jesus, okay, that has to be made official and formalized by, in essence, the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin. So we have to have a third Jewish trial where the Sanhedrin is gathered, and they basically have to formalize and rubber stamp this charge of blasphemy. So now let's take a look inside this third Jewish trial. Now Jesus is brought before all the entire Sanhedrin, right? Now, the Sanhedrin, again, because they've got to formalize this charge. So they've got to kind of go back and kind of retrench all of the ground Caiaphas did. So the Sanhedrin says, if you are the Messiah, tell us. Again, getting Jesus to try and incriminate himself. They're basically restating the question Caiaphas asked. Remember Caiaphas? Are you the Messiah? Okay. Now the Sanhedrin has to formalize everything. So they have to interrogate Jesus the same way Caiaphas did to formalize that, and they have to arrive at a charge of blasphemy the same as Caiaphas did to formalize that. So they've got to retrench all the ground Caiaphas went to make it official, make it formal. So if you are the Messiah, tell us, in essence, to make it official for the record, all right? Now, Jesus answers them the same way he answered Caiaphas. He quotes to them Daniel 7, verses 13 to 14, and in essence saying, yes, I am, okay? Then the Sanhedrin comes back and says, are you the Son of God? And Jesus then says, you say that I am. Again, responding the same way to them than he did to Caiaphas. You say that I am, okay? You say I'm the Son of God. Do you believe it? Or is that what you're being told? All right? And the Sanhedrin, after Jesus responds to them the same way he responded to Caiaphas, that the Sanhedrin reacts to those responses the same way Caiaphas does. The Sanhedrin says, look, we don't need any further testimony. This is blasphemy, and he's worthy of death. So the third Jewish trial, basically, in a large way, is kind of a repeat of the second Jewish trial, okay? But it's done to make it formal and official, because only then the Sanhedrin could formally charge somebody with the capital offense of blasphemy. Even the high priest Caiaphas couldn't formally do that, all right? He did it, but now it had to be formalized. So the whole Sanhedrin is convened. They basically ask Jesus the same questions. Jesus responds the same way, and they arrive at the same charge. No need for further testimony. This is blasphemy. He deserves death. So now, after the third of 3 Jewish trials, the capital offense of blasphemy has been formally and officially hung on Jesus. And because blasphemy is a capital offense, it's subject to capital punishment, the death penalty. So now, officially and formally, the Jewish religious leaders have what they were looking for all along: a charge of blasphemy, which is a death penalty charge. So at this point, you say, okay, well, basically they've got Jesus right where they want him, off to the cross, right? But we know, as Good Friday continues to dawn here, there's going to be 3 Roman trials. Oh, wait a second. They've got the charge they're looking for. Blasphemy is a death penalty charge. Why does there have to be 1 Roman trial, let alone 3? Again, Rome is the ruling nation. They're the ruling body, right? And only they had the authority to actually execute people. So yes, the Jewish religious leaders got the charge they're looking for, blasphemy. So Jesus is eligible, if you say, to be put to death. But they've still got to get Rome to sign off on it, because only Rome can actually perform the execution. That's why it's not quite a done deal yet. That's why the Jewish religious leaders then bring Jesus to Pilate, and that starts 3 separate Roman trials. Because you're thinking, why would they need to bring him to Pilate if they've already got the charge they're looking for? Because they've got to get Rome, in the body of Pilate, they've got to get Rome to sign off on this death penalty charge. Because only Rome can execute. But here's a little teaser as we wrap up this episode and Holy Thursday and move into Good Friday, the next 2 episodes. Here's a little teaser, right? That's not going to be as easy as the Jewish religious leaders think. Because remember, blasphemy is a violation of Jewish law. Pilate could care less about Jewish law, right? He cares about upholding the Roman civil law. So when the Jewish religious leaders are bringing Jesus from the Sanhedrin to Pilate, all right, saying, hey, we've just held our official gathering. This man has committed blasphemy. It's a death penalty charge. We want you to authorize his death, Pilate. Pilate's going to say, blasphemy? I don't care about that. You deal with it. Now, if he broke a Roman law, fine. Okay, I'll hear his case. But I don't care about blasphemy. Why are you even bringing him to me? So the Jewish religious leaders realize, between leaving the Sanhedrin and going to Pilate, we got a little bit of a problem. Yes, we've got him on blasphemy. Yes, that's the most serious Jewish charge you can get. But Pilate's not going to care about that. This is where the charge of blasphemy is going to morph into a charge of treason. Because that's a charge Pilate will take seriously. You commit blasphemy? Who cares if you're Pilate? You commit treason against Caesar? Pilate's got to take that seriously. So we'll see as we go from the 3 Jewish trials to the 3 Roman trials, we'll see in the midst of that, this blasphemy charge morph into a charge of treason. So a little teaser for our next 2 episodes, which will cover Good Friday. So that wraps up our 2-episode treatment of Holy Thursday. And specifically, that wraps up for this episode, the 3 Jewish trials. So as we leave things, Jesus is going from the Sanhedrin to Pilate. He's got a charge of blasphemy hung on him, which is a Jewish charge. And now we're going to see that charge morph into treason, and we're going to look at Jesus' back and forth with Pilate, and we'll compare it with his back and forth with Annas and Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. So with that, I went a little bit longer than I anticipated, but hopefully, I brought out some things maybe we didn't consider before that'll help us when we reflect and meditate on when we get to Holy Thursday during this Holy Week. So with that, I'll quickly close. Thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic, these teaching courses. And until the next episode, I'm Charles Merritt. Take care and God bless.